The way role playing games are presented to players and dungeon masters alike, in various core rule books, players' handbooks, dungeon masters' guides, game masters' guides, and so on and so forth, is somewhat inaccurate and has led to kind of you could say, a systemic failure across much of the player base to really understand what it is that they're doing. Uh, and this is in large part because going all the way back to the very beginning, to some degree, you don't want to tell the audience what the magic trick is, and also it's a point of sales. You want to present, this game in the most appealing way possible to attract the most amount of people to want to purchase it and continue to purchase the various supplements that come out after the initial book is released. Now, this is not to say that everything that you can find in those books in terms of like what is role playing is all fabricated or lies or unhelpful even, but I don't think it really fully properly explains things, because the general impression that a lot of people seem to have is that you're pretending to be someone else when you play these role playing games, and that the DM is kind of pretending to be God and or schizophrenically like a whole variety of different NPCs that they control, and ultimately can't help but personalize and want to see their NPCs pull off their NPCs' goals and all that kind of stuff. Uh, the thing is that at its core, role playing game is a strategic war game, and there's reasons why militaries, think tanks, strategists, people thinking through large scale disaster relief scenarios, all use role playing game scenarios, even if they're not using fantasy role playing or using dice and all that kind of stuff. Classically, this is much more of an intellectual exercise. Now, quite literally, D&D itself is ripped off a top of an older miniatures war game, not ripped off as in like, well, maybe you can make the contention for that kind of ripped off, but I don't necessarily mean it negatively. But it was a mod, maybe is a better way to put it, where it takes some of the basic core mechanics of the war game, but then focuses you down on just one particular individual unit on the field, and then plops them into a fantasy environment without actually having need of the miniatures. In a weird irony, modern fantasy role-playing games were taking the miniatures out of role-playing, and only for them to kind of end up being snuck back in after the fact, but in a slightly different form now. By putting it in a fantasy environment, it both, creates a greater variety of things that occur, because magic, allows for a lot of unexpected perturbations of events, and, like the fantasy setup of humans, elves, dwarves, and all that kind of stuff kind of allows one to, have stories that comment on sociology, but also while depersonalizing it by making all humans just part of one big lump sum human race, kind of a thing. But you're not really pretending to be someone else. I mean, there's the obvious surface level issue that some people have about players, that too many people are just basically just making decisions based on themselves and are basically just playing themselves, and just now they get to cast magic powers or have cat ears or whatever it is that the particular role-playing game they're playing offers them. And there, in some ways, there's just kind of almost like a simulated fantasy Sims life almost kind of approach to playing, versus the people who are actively pretending to be someone else and coming, which is closer to what you're supposed to be doing, but there's a level of detachment that actually needs to be considered when you're playing these things. This is a strategy game, whether you know it or not, more so than it's a game about combat or adventure, solving mysteries and riddles. It's about strategically maneuvering your character through a chain of events or scenes or environments, so that they can both accomplish whatever the stated goal is and or survive. And it involves, you need to be very aware of every detail that the dungeon master is presenting to you. You need to be very aware of all the ways the character can operate. You need to be aware of what your other players' characters are able to do. It's a big strategic scenario. It's just it's not always necessarily a military scenario. Sometimes just the basic strategy of noble court life, or trying to convince a barmaid, to take a message from you to, the evil priest on the edge of town, so that no one sees you to meet in public, or whatever it is. Like, it's all different kinds of strategy. How can this simulated being that you have control of, how can it accomplish its goals? It's not you. It's not you playing as something else. You are controlling a fictional character on a virtual game board. There's a reason why so many video games have elements in them that come directly from role-playing game rules. They are designed to be an interface with a virtual environment. It's just the original virtual environment of role-playing games is entirely just born of one's own imagination, and the imagination of the others around the table, and how they all kind of interact and influence each other. It's one of the things I like about role-playing games when they're actually in play, is that there's this interesting commingled imaginative event going on that nothing else quite gives you. That of itself is also part of a whole package of things that comes with role-playing games, and how their rules work, and the kinds of devices they use that all kind of add to them giving kind of a unique combination of experiences and adrenaline, dopamine, other kinds of chemical inputs from how you're reacting to these things and the events that happen in them. That gives you a unique cocktail that makes role-playing kind of addictive. And I think that's kind of part of why some people tend to cling to the initial versions of the games that they like as they grow older in age, and that this isn't just something that's new to the modern age and the modern argument, for instance, between 5e players and OSR players. There's very much the same kind of shit going on. You still see echoes of it to this day. People will argue about first edition and second edition, like angrily argue about it. It's like, and it's been decades since either of those have been in print, and all these decades later, they're practically compressed into basically just being the same thing, when looking at how much things have changed between both of them and where D&D is now, and all that kind of stuff. But the dice makes it addictive. The specific kind of adrenaline pulses of either the satisfaction of simulated victory, or the thrill of simulated danger. Even the loss factor, like losing, having your character die. There's a loss factor part of the cycle of gambling, where a part of what keeps someone putting money into lottery and stuff does actually factor into the fact that there's a certain amount of losing and the feelings that come with losing that drives you to go even harder to get the win feeling, kind of stuff. Like there's reasons why people tend to imprint on a specific initial type of role-playing game experience, and don't necessarily ever get off quite the same on a role-playing game that doesn't follow the exact same parameters. Because you're looking for that real specific, unique flavor, that cocktail of emotions and sensations and feelings that's all created by this strange little temporary telepathic virtual imagination phenomenon that occurs while a role-playing game is going on. And this all serves for the role-playing game people who write games to be able to, keep people coming back for more. Which, it seems like you could almost make it out to be a little sinister. Yeah, but I mean, what isn't like that? You ever notice that toy companies don't sell you all Ninja Turtles and all their villains in one big box for cheap? No, you got to buy them one at a time. And if you want to be cool amongst your friends, you got to, one by one, collect all 4 Ninja Turtles and Splinter and April O'Neil, Rocksteady and Bebop and Shredder and Krang and Krang's big dopey, meat body, and you gotta get a Triceraton, and why not Ray Fillet, and like so on and so forth. You got to have all the Transformers. You need all the GI Joes. You need all of Rift's various world books. You need all the various adventure modules that 5th edition has put out, because, oddly enough, each one's got a couple of different new playable character races. And oh my god, what if one of your players wants to play one? You better have the book about it. It's all a trick. But, everything's a trick in a way. Like, is it really any more real or unreal or bullshit than baseball? Collecting cards, playing video games all the time, working yourself to the bone constantly so you can have a nice house that you only basically have like 5 hours a day in, and you spend all of it asleep. Like all these lifestyles are optional. We're all equally stuck on this world with nothing to do. And so role-playing, despite of its flaws and such, is just as valid and fun of a way of doing it. But, I think people, should be a bit more conscious of what's really going on here. And it's not just something as simple as playing pretend, old games of yore of children playing cowboys and Indians, or running around in their backyards with a stick and a metal hoop. It's a bit not that quaint. And at its core, this is long predating any of this shit. This is going back like centuries, if not thousands of years. Role-playing has existed in various forms, and it's largely been a thing of kings and generals and other people who are like interested and have the time to think about large-scale anything. Like. And it's been turned into a child's game because it's been piggybacked through the fantasy genre by also, as I was saying, by taking a war game scenario and rule set and then popping it into a fantasy world, you get some interesting new kind of ways you can kind of play with what's going on, because you introduce magic or alien fantasy races. But it also piggybacks the popularity into all the people who potentially like the fantasy genre itself in fiction. And because of the way there's a lot of overlap between a lot of people who enjoy genre fiction, you can then piggyback into science fiction and horror and all the others, just by adding new different kinds of role-playing games or different scenarios that also appeal to those sorts of sensibilities. And as a business marketing strategy, it's taken a relatively niche hobby of miniatures tabletop wargaming. Back 60s and prior, people are into it, but it just wasn't quite as accessible and family friendly, ironically, in some ways, considering how there is resistance to this from various family-oriented organizations in the past. And now it's embraced largely just because corporations control everything now, and D&D is a much more corporate brand than it was in its heyday. This used to be a kind of an underground and almost punk rock kind of thing to be into. But in terms of how to play a role-playing game, it's not about the specific rules of the game. You're supposed to be aware that you are not the person you are playing. You're not even really playing them. You're controlling a fictional avatar. Your character sheet is your control pad, and it is a shared imagination process that is the CPU that drives the software, if you want to think in video game terms. And because of that, when it's firing on all its engines, it'll give you an experience like nothing else. But anything that can make such a claim is potentially addictive and sort of a drug. So always be cautious about those who are selling these to you without putting anything on the packages about the dangers. And stay waspinated.